Henry VIII is most remembered in history for the 6 wives that he had, and many historians believe that the wife he loved the most was Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife. This is because she gave the notorious Tudor King exactly what he wanted, in the form of a child and a male heir who would succeed him as the King of England. But Jane Seymour would tragically not live to see the day that her son became King Edward VI, as within days of giving birth, inside of Hampton Court Palace, she was taken seriously ill. She would never leave the confines of the palace, and she would succumb to a childbed-related illness which would cut short the life of Henry VIII's 3rd wife. But what is the story around the horrific death of King Henry VIII's 3rd wife? Jane Seymour would become the mistress of King Henry VIII, and she was a lady-in-waiting to Anne Boleyn, the king's 2nd wife, but the pair would flirt and would give each other gifts, and she captivated the king with her beauty. Following Anne Boleyn's death, Jane Seymour became the queen and married Henry VIII, but she would then fall pregnant. It's mostly accepted and believed that Jane Seymour died from complications caused by her giving birth to the future King Edward VI. At the time, inside of Tudor England, giving birth to a child was very dangerous and had many different risks, and it was very common for women to experience serious symptoms and conditions following giving birth to a child. Regarding the birth of King Edward VI, Nicholas Saunders, a Catholic writer, stated that Jane Seymour was in severe labour in a difficult childbirth. All her limbs were stretched for the purpose of making a passage for the child, or as others stated, having the womb cut before she was dead, so that the child, ready to be born, might be taken out. The travail of the Queen being very difficult, the king was asked which of the 2 lives was to be spared. He answered the boys because he could easily provide himself with other wives. There was some form of belief that Jane Seymour may have been cut open to give birth, or may have had a caesarean section. However, there is no concrete evidence alluding to this. There was no historical record of this procedure being carried out before the 1580s, and Jane would have been given the best care and the best midwives and doctors throughout England to look after her. If Jane had a procedure such as this to give birth to Edward VI, then it's believed that her death would have been horrific and brutal, and caesareans today still have a significant form of risk. But there was some more evidence that stated that Jane Seymour gave birth in a different way. In 1643, Sir Richard Baker claimed that Jane had been experiencing labour pains for 6 or more, and that she would beg with doctors to have the baby cut out of her to stop her suffering. There have also been many others who have claimed that Jane suffered from puerperal fever, or that she had sustained an infection which was caused by giving birth to Edward. There were no doctor records which have survived that specific illness and problems that she was afflicted with. But it was said that Jane Seymour went into labour in the afternoon of the 9th of October 1537, and it was around 2 a.m. on the 12th of October when Edward was born, meaning her labour went on officially for around 3 days. She had signed letters announcing the birth of her son, but then, on the 15th of October, she was sitting up in bed in her chambers in Hampton Court Palace, and she had a number of visitors and guests who gave her the best wishes following the birth. Many of these had visited her whilst they attended the christening of her son, but the fact she had visitors meant that this could have ruled out a caesarean section, as she would have needed a long time to recover and take time to heal. But 4 days after the birth of Edward, Jane Seymour would become rather ill and sick. Her priests and doctors stated that her symptoms were a natural lax, by reason whereof she began to lighten and become more cheerful, and as it appeared to mend, and so continued till towards night. All this night she hath been very sick. Jane did recover and got a little better the next day, but there were no other accounts of her health declining until the 19th of October. Jane was said on this day to be unwell yet again, and she got sicker over the weekend, and by the following Monday it was clear that she was in a very dangerous place and that her health was grave. On Tuesday, Henry VIII, her husband, was summoned to her bed inside of Hampton Court, and she would sit with her husband, and he prayed with her and stayed with her for some time. But to the royal doctors it was clear that she would not make it and that she was dying. She managed to live a little longer, but at 2 a.m. on the 24th of October 1537, Jane Seymour died inside the same rooms that she gave birth to the successor. Many people attributed the Queen's death to the fault of them that were about her, and suffered her to take great cold and to eat things which she fancy in her sickness called for. The account that holds this report is only written documentation in existence about Jane's illness and disease. The claims that she had violent food poisoning and stomach problems, and it also said she had a great cold that led to her dying from a high fever. This was common, as it is today, and after giving birth, Jane, who was vulnerable, would have been more susceptible to poor health and catching illness. One other thing to consider is that Jane Seymour may have suffered with sepsis or blood poisoning, as Alison Weir and 4 other doctors have stated that they are sceptical about the fever causing Jane's death. They said as Jane was stated to have been hosting guests following the christening and eating food, it is unlikely that she developed postnatal fever from this, and she may have had an embolism or suffered with dehydration that weakened her heart. Hampton Court was a place where Jane Seymour had spent a lot of time, but following her death, Henry VIII, her husband, would leave to Windsor to mourn. On the 1st of November, he declared that Jane should be quickly buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor, and she was buried on the 12th of November. The court were ordered to wear mourning clothes, and Henry VIII wore purple, as everyone around him wore black. The king left the planning of the funeral to others, and the Duke of Norfolk carried these out, and Jane's body was taken from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle, and the king did not attend. But Jane Seymour was the first Queen of England since Elizabeth of York to die not being disgraced. The same protocol was used for Elizabeth's funeral, and Jane Seymour had a huge procession, and there were 200 masses ordered to be sung for her soul. Her body was embalmed, and her heart and entrails were removed, and it's believed that these are buried under the high altar inside of Hampton Court Palace. She was dressed in a robe of gold with jewels, and her crown was placed on her head, and she laid in state inside her chambers for days. But during the funeral, her stepdaughter Mary was the chief mourner, and she rode on horseback. She was followed by 29 mourners, one for every year of Jane's life, and an effigy of the Queen was also on the procession, and the crowds looked on in silence. The procession got to Windsor days before, and they were met at the entrance of the chapel, before Jane's coffin was taken into the church, and was met at the altar by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Prayers were said as the body lay in state throughout the night. Mary kept a vigil beside it, and the following day Mass was sung. On the 12th of November, a huge funeral ceremony took place, and Jane Seymour was laid to rest, where she received full honours of a queen in a vault beneath the gartered chapel, and her 2 brothers, Edward and Thomas, were there. As her coffin was lowered into the vault, the Queen's staff broke their staves of office and threw them into the grave to show their service ending. For the next 6 hours, the bells of London tolled out. A Mass was heard 2 days later at St Paul's Cathedral, and this signalled the end of the funeral services for the Queen. But Henry VIII would choose to, in his own death, be buried alongside Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife. Many believe this is because he loved her the most, but the marriage was tragically cut short, and it's likely that if Jane would have survived, then she would have been the last of the king's wives. But Jane Seymour would be planned to be buried with Henry in a huge and ornate tomb, but this would never be made. Still today, 500 years later, Jane Seymour and Henry VIII are buried inside of a vault next to each other. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.